Jessica Johnson, who is a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at the University of Oregon. She studies early modern art with an emphasis on 17th and 18th century British art and its global contexts. She's particularly interested in portraiture and the visual representation of people of color during this period. Jess earned a BA in the history of art and architecture at Boston University in 2017, and an MA in art and museum studies at Georgetown University in 2018, where she participated in the art and business semester program at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. Jess has held internships at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, the National Portrait Gallery, Christie's, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. As a 2025-26 Oregon Humanities Center Dissertation Fellow, Jess has been working on a project called Black Georgians, Portraiture, Race, and Class in Britain During the Age of Empire. She shares her work in progress with us today. Thank you so much.
You sound very impressive, by the way. I haven't heard that. So anyway, awesome. Thank you for having me here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity that OHC has provided me with this fellowship. I'm also excited to hear guys' feedback and insights on my topic, and I hope to have a good discussion and hopefully you'll generate some good ideas. You already read my title of my dissertation, so I'm going to say it out loud again. But before I actually do dive into my dissertation, I want to give a little historical context about Black Britons. So, there is evidence that Blacks have been in Britain since the Roman era, as a number of sub-Saharan Africans served as Roman soldiers during the expansion of the empire into England and Wales. Over the centuries, the Black presence continued to grow in England, and in the Tudor era, Blacks, who were frequently called blackamoors during the period, worked primarily as artisans, musicians, and domestic servants. There's even a record of a trumpeter of African descent employed in the court of Henry VII. By Elizabeth I's rule, the Black population increased so much so that many white Britons complained of the community and used them as a scapegoat. And in response, Queen Elizabeth I, from 1595 to 1601, declared proclamations to deport and ban Blacks from England. But unfortunately for her, it didn't work. It failed. And many people of African descent continued to live in England. So in the Stuart era, the Black population continued to grow as Britain became increasingly involved in the transatlantic slave trade and established an empire across the Atlantic. In 1623, Britain established its first permanent settlement in the Caribbean on the island of St. Kitts. In 1655, the British captured Jamaica from the Spanish. And then in 1660, the Royal African Company was founded, which established a monopoly on British trade with Africa, and which actually included the slave trade. So in the Georgian era, Britain continued to expand its colonies in the Americas. Most notably in 1756, through the 7 Years' War, Britain gained a significant amount of land in the Caribbean from the Spanish and French. Due to rapid expansions of its colonies and the growing interest in plantation economies, there was a large increase of Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. And because of this, the late 18th century is considered the height of the British transatlantic slave trade. After the Revolutionary War, many enslaved Blacks who served for the British forces to gain their freedom emigrated to Britain. In 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed, which made the importation of enslaved Africans within the British Empire illegal, but did not actually abolish the practice of slavery. It wasn't until 1833 the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, which did abolish slavery within the British Empire. By the late 18th century, Britain had an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Black inhabitants. The majority of the Black population within Britain lived in major port cities such as London, Liverpool, and Bristol. Many of them worked as sailors, soldiers, and servants, and due to primarily working at the docks and the domestic service, many Blacks integrated into the white working class community. The presence of working class and enslaved Blacks in Britain during this period is well documented and acknowledged in the arts and archival records. Within the arts, depictions of Blacks within the working class were common, the most common being Black servants, who served as visual accessories within elite portraiture or genre scenes to indicate wealth or imperial connections. At other times, in satirical art, Blacks served as an indication of imperial overindulgence and corruption. Often the inclusion of Black figures not employed in domestic service served as caricatures of unrefined and lewd behavior within urban life. As you see here, this man is grabbing this other woman's boobs. So, yeah. The depiction of Blacks in subservient domestic roles or as racial caricatures has widely been analyzed by scholars. Some of the most notable being David Devine in his 1985 publication, Hogarth's Blacks, Images of Blacks in 18th Century English Art. And also Esther Chadwick, Meredith Gamer, and Sarah Levinson, who in 2014 curated an exhibition at the Yale Center for British Art titled Figures of Empire, Slavery, and Portraiture in 18th Century Atlantic Britain. And finally, there's Temi Odumosu, who published a book in 2017 called Africans in English Caricature, 1769 to 1819, Black Jokes, White Humor. So in the context of media, recently there has been a rise in depiction of Blacks within Georgian Britain in non-subservient roles or as part of the middle to upper classes. One of the most popular instances I see here is Netflix's Bridgerton, which is very popular. I don't get it, but whatever. But which portrays some members of the monarchy, nobility, and gentry as people of color. The show's popularity has led to what is called the Bridgerton effect, which has sparked a renewed interest in Georgian Britain and an interest in the lives of people of color during the period. And while the show is really popular, and rightfully so, I guess, Shonda Rhimes did a good job, the show has been criticized for historical inaccuracies, which caused many to question the validity of the presence of people of color, especially Blacks, amongst the upper classes of British society during the period. It is important to note that Bridgerton is a work of historical fiction. I would hope so, because honestly, it's a little scandalous. It's a work of historical fiction and took many liberties in its depiction of the Georgian era. However, while the scale is exaggerated in the show, it is true that there were instances of Black individuals who were part of the middle to upper classes. Some of them inherited the statuses, like mixed-race individuals from the West Indies who were sent to England by their wealthy white fathers for formal education and potentially later integration into British high society. Others, like former servants or the formerly enslaved, gained their status through education, social connections, and their abolitionist advocacy. Such individuals became well known for their intellect and overall integration into British society. And I'm interested in exploring the real stories, not the Bridgerton one, fake ones, but the real stories of Blacks within the British upper classes, especially their portrayal and reception within Georgian society. So Georgian Britain greatly benefited from the imperial wealth that was generated through the global slave trade. And many British elites displayed their wealth through the acquisition and display of luxury items, such as these items here, that were associated with imperial power and wealth. Products such as sugar and rum were produced through slave labor in the West Indies and were often displayed in vessels decorated with images of enslaved Blacks in subservient poses, as you can see here, especially that one on the right-hand side, the candelabra, has an enchained Black individual holding the candles. Sorry, back again. Okay, so the display and connection of slavery with luxury objects maybe consider how Blacks of high status may have felt, or what they experienced within these white elite spaces. It also made me question, how does a wealthy Black individual of status fashion themselves in a society often filled with images of racial inferiority and subservience? So maybe asking, why use Portraiture to figure this out, to answer these questions? To answer that, I'm going to read a quote. A little excerpt written by Jonathan Richardson, who was an English portrait artist and art theorist, in his 1715 publication, An Essay on the Theory of Painting, in which he explains what a portrait should do. Bear with me, it's a long quote. Upon the sight of a portrait, the character and master strokes of the history of the person it represents are apt to flow in upon the mind and to be subject of conversation. So that to sit for one's picture is to have an abstract of one's life written and published. To be a good face painter, a degree of historical and poetical genius is requisite. 'Tis not enough to make a tame, insipid resemblance of the features, so that everybody shall know who the picture is intended for. A portrait painter must understand mankind and enter into their characters, and express their minds as well as their faces. If there be anything particular in the history of the person which is proper to be expressed, as it is still a farther description of him, it is a great improvement to the portrait to them that know that circumstance. So essentially, according to Richardson, a successful portrait serves as a biography of the sitter. Closely examining portraits can reveal biographical information or aspects such as the sitter's family lineage, career, or personality. And in my case, it's important to note how portraiture is utilized as a tool for crafting one's public image and identity in that regard. So, in my dissertation, I consider how Black social elites perceived and fashioned themselves through portraiture, and in turn were perceived within British society. To understand how art was used to fashion these identities, I will examine in my project their experience and reception within in these predominantly white social spaces and how they situated themselves more broadly within society. It's important to note that not every Black individual of high status shared the same experience or views. Some were abolitionists, while others expressed pro-slavery sentiments as they financially benefited from slave labor. Many held different positions within society, which further illustrates the complexities of such an identity. Since their experience in Georgian society was not universal, it's important to see how these differing Black elites fashioned identity and were perceived individually within British society. White British society, I should especially say. The purpose of my dissertation is to consider the utilization of portraiture to convey the formation and complexities of Black diasporic identity through the arts in a society dictated by Georgian concepts of racial and class hierarchies. Also, its purpose is to investigate how influential and wealthy Blacks crafted and communicated a social elite identity that, at times, challenged prevailing concepts of racial inferiority. And then some of my aims is that through the lens of portraiture, I aim to contribute to the expanding narrative of the Black diaspora within the ruling center of the British Empire prior to the abolition of slavery in 1833. I also want to try to demonstrate the study of Black social elite portraiture demonstrate that it compellingly exemplifies the utilization of the arts to develop a visual culture of a burgeoning community and to craft an individual's public identity in an effort to shape societal perception. So I'm going to take a quick thing about my methodology. So methodology, I primarily look at paintings as a primary source. And with that, I also consult archival materials such as letters, wills, records, and publications from the period. And I use those to provide historical background on the sitter, but also as a way to gain a perspective of the desired public persona or social structures versus the actual reality that's seen in the period. So my approach is partly influenced by our historian scholars of portraiture, such as Beth Fox-Tobin and her theory of cultural cross-dressing, which she describes as a form of cultural hybridity and is introduced in her 1999 book called Picturing Imperial Power, Colonial Subjects in 18th Century British Painting. In her book, Tobin argues that these depictions of cultural hybridity are a strategy used by colonizers to create new identities designed to enhance the social status and or power, or by the colonized as a form of resistance or assimilation. Another prominent scholar is Darcy Grimaldo Grisby, who has a chapter titled Black Revolution Saint-Domingue, Girardet's Portrait of Citizen Belle, ex-representative of the colonies, 1797. Sorry, long title. From her 2002 book titled Extremities, Painting Empire in Post-Revolutionary France, which explores paintings that exhibit quote-unquote colonial contact as a form of hybridity. In the chapter, she argues that portraits of Blacks that depict colonial contact serve as a strategy to depict an elevated status and strategy to subvert tropes of racial subservience or dependence on white society, often seen in abolitionist visual culture. So my dissertation kind of combines the two. I consider both Tobin's concept of cultural cross-dressing and Grisby's colonial contact to observe how Black elites utilize conventions in British portraiture to simultaneously assert/elevate their status and combat tropes of racial inferiority. So my dissertation is divided into 3 chapters. Each chapter focuses on a single sitter. And the aim of each chapter is to show complexities and nuances of Black identity in Britain, and also to connect with the broader issues or occurrences regarding the intersection of race and class within Georgian society. The first chapter looks at, the first chapter of my dissertation looks at Dido Elizabeth Bell. And her portrait is probably the most well-known portrait of a Black elite during the period. It's quite famous. It actually has a movie. There's a whole movie called Belle. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It came out in 2013. Definitely is not fully true, but but it's a great romance story, okay? It's still a good movie. Anyway, sorry, shocking. So Dido Bell was the daughter of Sir John Lindsay, who was a rear admiral in the Royal Navy, and an enslaved Black woman named Maria Bell. Her father, who was a member of influential Murray and Lindsay families, requested his uncle, William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield, and the nation's Lord Chief Justice, to raise his daughter while he was abroad. So in London, Dido was raised alongside her cousin, as seen here, Lady Elizabeth Murray. And around 1778, Lord Mansfield commissioned Scottish portrait artist David Martin to paint Dido with her cousin. So previous scholarship on this painting has acknowledged Martin's portrait of Dido, but most studies have not conducted a really close examination of the artwork, as scholars often utilize the paintings as visual evidence of Dido's existence within the Murray home. Notably, in the first published biography of Dido, Paula Byrne begins her book in Belle, The True Story of Dido Belle in 2014, that's what the movie is based off of, by the way, with the description of the double portrait before the author investigates Dido's life, family, and the conditions of Georgian London, which were deeply entangled with the transatlantic slave trade. Other sources briefly discuss the portrait as emphasizing the general exotic and othering nature of Dido's Oriental dress, seen here, in comparison to her white cousin's European attire. They've argued also that the unique dress vaguely signifies her exotic origins and serves as a counterpoint to her cousin's whiteness, which further emphasizes Georgian concepts of racial inferiority and stereotypes. On the other hand, fashion historian Kenna Leibs considers more broadly how Dido's dress may reflect the fashionable trend of trickery within female British portraiture during the period. Instead of her clothing being an indicator or signifier of general exoticism. Jennifer German analyzes Dido's portrait, and in her analysis of it, she introduces the possibility that Dido's dress may express specific biographical information, such as her father's career abroad, rather than serving as a symbol of general exoticism. When examining portraits of Black and mixed-race women, German argues that the significance of considering the sitter's race, gender, status, and wealth, as well as the structures of power that shaped their experience in London. She also highlights the importance of portraiture as a visual technology for establishing and solidifying racial identity during the period. However, German emphasizes how Black Georgian women's lived experience in their portraits demonstrated the instability of race during the period. So in my first chapter, I expand on German's work by exploring the intricacies of Martin's portrait of Dido, which demonstrate the biographical nature of portraiture, a nature complicated by her illegitimate and mixed-race status. I argue that through close examination of the portrait, that it reveals the ways in which Martin references the established racialized artistic tropes, satirical traditions, and family portraiture to present a socially acceptable portrait of Dido and her relations without sparking public outcry. I also argue that the artist represents both sides of Dido's heritage through artistic references, such as her Black Caribbean side, which he does through alluding to traditional depictions of Black figures in the visual arts and the sartorial objects associated with the Black diaspora, such as the headdress, which is seen here. And he also references her white elite British ancestry by referencing portraits of her white aristocratic family members to subtly signify her noble British ancestry. So my analysis of the painting, I connect the portrait with the concerns with miscegenation during the period. So Edward Long, a white Jamaican plantation owner, expressed these concerns in his publication very famously and very openly. He complains that, quote, "It has been too long custom for every father in Jamaica who has acquired a little property to send his children of whatever complexion to Britain for education." Long considers the long-term consequences of such actions, and he stated, "Thus, in the course of a few generations more, the English blood will become so contaminated with this mixture, and from the chances, the ups and downs of life, this alloy may spread so extensively as even to reach the middle and then the higher orders of the people, till the whole nation resembles the Portuguese and Moriscos in complexion of skin and baseness of mind." Definitely not a fan. Oopsie, sorry. So more broadly, I argue that the artist plays into the ambiguous distinction between Black servant and a Black aristocrat to present a socially acceptable portrait, family portrait that includes Dido, who is illegitimate and was raised by a white social elite family. And that is actually a necessity for the artist to circumvent these social decorum, the strict social decorum, which reveals the restrictions imposed by the period's racial and social hierarchies on the upper classes, including those of African descent, and further demonstrates the broader anxieties around miscegenation within Britain that some viewed as threatening to destabilize the existing power structure within the British Empire. Thus, the analysis of Dido's portrait unveils the ambiguous and often contradictory status of mixed race elites within British society, and ultimately the complexities of conveying mixed race identity within portraiture. So the next chapter, my second chapter, looks at Prince Saunders. Prince Saunders was an African-American writer, intellectual, educator, and diplomat born in Vermont in 1775 to formerly enslaved parents. Enslaved parents. He was educated at Dartmouth and later worked in Boston as an educator to the city's growing Black community. He achieved social mobility and became well connected with the Boston elite learned class and abolitionist communities. Between 1815 and 1818, Saunders repeatedly resided in London as a member of high society. Due to his given name, many British aristocrats mistook the highly educated African-American man for a member of African nobility. They thought his name Prince was actually a title instead of actual first name, which is very interesting. And so his mingling amongst the upper classes in England was possible because during the period in Georgian era, there was a strong belief of the greater significance of class over race. So during his time in London, Saunders commissioned portraits by William Arnsfield Hobday, which is on the right-hand side, and Richard Evans, which only survives as a print, an engraving by Charles Turner, which is on the left-hand side, that reflects his high status that he achieved in London. So for scholarly research on these portraits, I have not seen anything about these portraits really in art historical context. Most scholarly studies on Saunders actually focuses on his content that he wrote. He wrote a book called Haitian Papers in 1816, and which is a translation and commentary of the laws of Haiti. So people often talk about that, and if they do talk about the portrait frontispiece, it's more acknowledging that this engraving exists at the frontispiece of the book. And then for the Hobday portrait, because it's really recently been acquired by LACMA, there has not been any art historical analysis of this portrait that I have seen. I actually did email them, and they say, if you do anything, let us know. So, first time for everything, right? So anyway, more broadly, Saunders' time in London has not been extensively explored by scholars. Many focus on his contributions to the education and betterment of Blacks in New England, and they also focus on his role as diplomat and advisor to the King of Haiti, which is a whole interesting career he had. And then lastly, they also often focus on his advocacy for Black immigration to the newly established Kingdom of Haiti. However, I'm interested in his very short period of time in London, which led to him gaining an international presence. In this chapter, which is divided into two parts, I explore the dual identities that Saunders presented to the British public, that of an African royal and that of a Black intellectual. In the first part, I examine Hobday's portrait of Saunders, which depicts him in noble, elegant court attire. Okay. And more broadly for this chapter, I consider the reception of African nobility within Georgian Britain and the role of portraiture in conveying Black elite status in a racialized and class-conscious society by analyzing portraits of African-American princes made during their visits. So some examples of that are Ayuba Salomon Diallo and William Ansa Sasaraku, and both these princes who are seen here were from African noble families. They both were kidnapped and enslaved in the Americas, but freed upon, I'm going to say, the acknowledgement of the noble lineage, but really more politically speaking, why they were freed. Yes, yeah, it was very interesting. And they both actually traveled to London and spent time there and had kind of celebrity status while being in London, and they were described as African princes by the British public, so they had a lot of attention. And because of their celebrity status at the time, they actually notably had portraits made in London that commemorated communicated their identities and their time there to celebrate it. And in each portrait, they really do differ in like what they're presenting, but both the paintings express their elite status. So, as I said before, Saunders he differs from these people because he's not possessed any noble ancestry. He's all of Rus. And so in the chapter, I will examine how Saunders' clothing asserts his elevated status, as fanciful dress based on historical Stuart attire instead of contemporary clothing reflects the earlier late 18th century trend of Van Dyck style dress within British portraiture, which was associated with the British aristocracy. So the reason behind Van Dyck dress during the period varies. Some appreciated the timelessness that the costume attire provided the sitter, especially at a time when it's amid rapidly changing fashions. And for others, the Van Dyck dress was a method to help visually legitimize their place within society. Some used attire to communicate an aristocratic legacy by visually associating the sitter with their noble ancestors. And for those who achieved social mobility, either by acquiring new wealth or by a sudden rise in status, yet lacked an aristocratic lineage, the costuming created a false visual association between the sitter and past nobility. So by the time of Saunders' portrait, the popularity of Van Dyck dress was totally not in fashion. It pretty much waned. So the decision to depict him in such attire was kind of unusual, especially since Hobday, he often did not use this type of kind of costuming in his portraits, which I think suggests that Saunders may have presented this idea to the artist. And so, like, maybe before him, Saunders may have liked the aesthetics or timelessness of their attire. But again, as a highly educated man attuned to the fashion of elite society, it seems unlikely that he would have chosen to use an outdated trend for these reasons alone. So Saunders, I say, most likely would have understood the significance of conveying one's Black elite identity through the strategic utilization of British artistic conventions, especially through clothing. And despite Saunders' foreign origins, for those who believed him to be royalty, the costume evokes the image of Saunders hailing from a long line of aristocracy, visually suggesting a history of Black nobility. By alluding to a past era, like other recently socially elevated Britons, Saunders legitimizes his high status within British society. In truth, as I said before, Saunders was not a descendant of nobles or royals. He was the son of previously enslaved Blacks and most likely born into slavery. During his visits to aristocratic residences in London, he may have noticed the use of enslaved Black figures as accessories in elite portraiture, and that in portraits of sitters in Van Dyck costume, enslaved Blacks were not dressed the same as their white enslavers. For example, in Johann Zoffany's group portrait of the young family, the family wears the lavish and laced clothing of the Stuart court. In contrast, the artist dresses the enslaved Black attendant in fine but contemporary 18th century attire. The clear distinction in clothing reinforces the social and racial hierarchies within Britain and reflects the established use of historical dress and portraiture as a symbol of elite status. I argue also that by wearing such historical dress in his portrait, as a descendant of enslaved Blacks, Saunders indirectly engages with the depiction of Blacks in Van Dyck-style portraits. By wearing a Van Dyck costume, Saunders and Hobday demonstrate how the attire no longer solely applies to white elite Britons. So in the second part of my chapter, I take a look at Charles Turner's engraved version of Saunders' portrait as intellectual. So this section, the section considers the Georgian concepts of racial intelligence and the reception of Black intellectuals in British society. And I explore the previous depictions of celebrated Black intellectuals in portraiture, such as Francis Williams, who is seen here, who's from Jamaica, and from Ignacio Sancho, right here, who was born on a voyage across the Atlantic in a slave ship, but was actually raised in England. So by examining the portraits of Saunders during his time, by examining the portraits of Saunders during his time in London, I hope to provide an insight into the fragility of the high social status of Black elites in Britain, as their position relied on the perception of white Europeans, who created a nuanced stratification of Blacks within the greater social order. I also want to look into how portraiture has been used to assert these Black elite statuses by utilizing British artistic conventions to differentiate them from lower classes and or enslaved Blacks. And ultimately, I want to look into or kind of see or get insight into how the tenuous distinction between enslaved and free existed, and which reflects more broadly the concept of who could and should be enslaved. So in the last chapter, my third chapter, it looks at Ira Aldridge. Ira Aldridge was an African-American born in New York City who became the first known Black Shakespearean actor in Britain and the most famous Shakespearean actor in Europe during the mid-19th century. He's most famously known for his portrayal of Othello in Shakespeare's Othello. As a teenager in New York City, Aldridge saw Shakespearean performances by Black actors at the African Grove Theater. Shortly later, he joined the same acting troupe, before its theater burned down under very suspicious conditions in 1823. The next year, he immigrated to England and performed Othello for the first time on a British stage in 1825. He gained larger celebrity status when he played the role of Othello in 1833 at Covent Garden, after replacing Edmund King, a celebrated white dramatic actor who died during the opening week. He was an understudy. So, while Aldridge's performances as Othello, both in 1825 and 1833, garnered public attention and praise, he also was dubbed the African Roscius, I mispronounce it, which is a famous classical, I'm guessing, actor. Yeah. Anyway, the parents say he's really good. He also received a lot of criticism on his performance, so bear with me, these are pretty rough. The Times in 1825 says, Aldridge's figure is unlucky for the stage. Owing to the shape of his lips, it is utterly impossible for him to pronounce English in such a manner as to satisfy even the unfastidious ears of the gallery. Another review from the Athenaeum says, it is possible that Mr. Aldridge should fully comprehend the meaning and force of even the words he utters. And he's going. The Figaro says in 1833, it's because nature has supplied the man with a skin that renders soot Soot and butter superfluous. It is on the strength of his blackness that he considers himself competent to enact the part of the Moor of Venice. In the same year, same publication, writes, this wretched upstart is about to defile the stage by a foul butchery of Shakespeare, and Othello is actually the part chosen for the sacrilege. We must again inflict on him such a chastisement as must drive him from the stage he has dishonored and force him to find in the capacity of footman or street sweeper that level for which his color appears to have rendered him peculiarly qualified. Sorry. So based on these racist critiques, I am really interested in examining the issues of race and class within Shakespearean theater, because they often kind of mention how he isn't also not only the right race, but also the wrong size level to actually understand Shakespeare perform it. And so I'm interested in exploring how Aldrich had to strategically combat both those elements, which is very unique at the time because there's no other Black actors doing this at the time. There were instances of white Shakespearean actors having to combat the concept of Shakespeare only being for the upper classes, and then eventually they kind of raised in status and it was accepted. But again, the fact that Aldrich had to combat both those elements is very interesting and probably very difficult. So in the chapter, I actually focus on examining two early portraits of the actor in the role of Othello. So the two paintings are by James Northcote and William Mulready, which painted the actor shortly after his debut in 1826. So while both artists depict the same individual, the portrayals of Aldrich notably differs in tone, setting, and physical features. As you can see, looks like two totally different men. And previous scholars have acknowledged these portraits as the start of depictions of the actor in character during his long career, and that these paintings show the significance of Othello being played by a man of color. So I'm curious about investigating as to the potential reasons as to why and what these differing depictions reflects about the period, especially about the period's racial perspective of Shakespeare's Othello. And in the chapter, I compare other portrayals of Othello and also actors in the guise of the character. So, for example, Edmund King right here is in the character of Othello, again, the man that he actually replaced who died in the opening week. Looks very different than the other depictions of Aldrich as Othello. And then also I will compare it to potential references of portraits of people of color in Britain, such as Francis Barber, who was painted by Joshua Reynolds, who actually was Northcote's teacher. Overall, I'm interested in seeing how Mulready and Northcote's depiction of Aldrich as Othello differs from other portrayals and how they're related to the discourses of race in Shakespearean theater during the period. And so the main point of my dissertation really is to display the nuances of Black diasporic identity, to show how portraits reflect wider issues and concepts during the period, to illuminate unique stories from the past to demonstrate representation amongst the various classes, including people of color in British history, which reveals such depictions as not necessarily being part of the quote-unquote woke agenda propaganda. There is truth in historical diversity. It requires a nuanced understanding of the period, which demonstrates the complexities of Black social identity in the metropole during the Age of Empire. So thank you so much for listening. I would appreciate any of you guys' feedback, honestly, especially on chapter 2 and 3. Thank you.
So great that you left us. Well, first of all, the presentation was fantastic. And then thank you for leaving us really ample time for conversation.
Yeah, I probably went really quickly. Sorry.
But that means that we can really have a rich conversation. So I think since there's so many of us in the room, let's operate by raising hands. And do you want to moderate your own, or do you want me to be?
You can moderate.
All right, okay. I can just go where I can see people.
Oh, I mean, I can do it if it's easier for me to do it. You want me to do it?
Whatever you prefer.
I can do it. It's fine.
All right. Okay.
You don't have to get up.
So thanks so much, Jessica. This is a really wonderful project and super interesting in the diversity of figures and locations and sort of biographies. And so thinking along those lines and thinking about the question of that you raised of portraiture as biography, can you tell us a little bit more about the artists?
Yeah.
And sort of the social situation of the artists and to what extent the artists enter into your analysis.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily go into that for this talk, but I do kind of explore that, especially, one second. Sorry, a lot of pictures, last slides. Okay, so for example, David Martin is I think actually a great example of this. So David Martin was the pupil of Alan Ramsey, who actually happened to be the uncle-in-law of Dido Bell. This artist actually had knowledge of her before he met her, and the interesting thing about it is that his teacher Ramsey, he actually eloped with Dido's aunt. And that family that she belonged to was the upper, like, really influential Scottish clans. They actually owned Scone Palace, which is it's very significant historical site. And of course, marrying a artist was seen as way beneath her, and so they caused a rift in the family. But Dido's father was the only one who actually supported that marriage. And so the interesting thing about David Martin, also not only knowing the daughter, or Dido, I should say, he also painted other figures within the family. So he painted the father, he painted Lord Mansfield, the adopted father, or I should say great uncle, and he also painted other some of her aunts. And so I think that some of this, like, his knowledge, interpersonal knowledge of Dido, really kind of affects how he's portraying her, because also knowing, like, he can't necessarily just portray a whole full family portrait, because that would be totally inappropriate. But I kind of think about how, looking at elements, especially her clothing, looking at closely those elements, and thinking how someone with that knowledge can actually understand this painting versus someone who doesn't really know who she is and think that, because honestly, I didn't go into this in this presentation, but this painting, for a long time, people thought that it was just Lady Elizabeth with a black servant. And so I argue in the chapter, by kind of that weird kind of slippage between servant and, like, obviously elements that show her upperclassness, is kind of making it kind of relying on the viewer of, like, what they think this person is, who they think they are, and that kind of makes it acceptable in a way. But again, having more knowledge of the ins and outs of Dido's parentage or lineage, it gives it a more well-rounded and very biographical kind of element in a way. So hope that answered a little bit. The other ones. These ones, I have no idea. So Hobday, he actually was active in Bath and London. So I actually do know so Saunders actually went to his studio, paid £20 for a sitting, it was only an hour-long sitting, and had this portrait made. And I'm not necessarily as familiar with Hobday's, like, I'm going to say, like, the knowledge of Saunders, but because the fact that you sit with him, meet with him, you probably got some kind of conversation. Saunders is very charming. Like, he charmed the pants off of you. And interestingly enough, Saunders was obviously quite happy with this painting, and he had this painting unveiled, happens, just coincidentally, during a party at his house with all the high-end people, including, he was friends with John Quincy Adams, who was an ambassador to,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So Saunders actually was a friend of theirs, actually befriended Quincy Adams' sons on the journey from Boston to London. And so he often took them out for educational things. So, so a lot of people were at that party, and he was like, oh no, this is in the way, so because of that, the painting was the talk of the whole night. And then for the engraving, actually based off a painting by Richard Evans, who Saunders actually found in London, and because, a little background, Saunders became the advisor to the King of Haiti, right? So, and that was at the suggestion of major abolitionists in London, because the King of Haiti was seeking British support. So, because he was recommended to go to Haiti, he also helped gain, like, I'm going to say, resources and people to be useful to the king. So he actually got Richard Evans to come with him to Haiti to become, like, the official court painter in a way for the new kingdom. So I'm not sure. We don't really know exactly when the actual painting was made. Again, it's lost. I cannot find it at all. The only version is the prints. But the fact that it seems like in the study, and it also could potentially be, he might have had it done actually in Haiti. It might be his office, his study in Haiti. Who knows? But obviously for this one, the artist was very much aware of the sitter and has some kind of relationship in some way or another, who also saw potential in the Kingdom of Haiti, having a black empire, or not empire, but a black kingdom ruled by people who were previously enslaved. So definitely probably more abolitionist ties in that regard. And there was another one. Once again. Yeah, these ones, I obviously know who the artists are. James Northcote, he was 80 years old when he painted Aldrich, which is very old. And the interesting thing about this, there's no real knowledge about, like, the commissioning of it, but it is known that the Manchester Art Gallery actually bought this painting. It's the first painting that actually became part of his collection. And so a lot of times people talk about this painting and also the artist as being, like, abolitionist in nature. So we're like, we have a long history of abolition in Manchester, that whole thing. But that's kind of all I know about that. I also, not entirely sure, he probably met. The idea of his sitting is interesting because the guy looks so different, right? And it's like, is that really him? But they say the thing's written, it says it's him. And so the interesting thing that I thought was interesting, it's like the fact that this looks so similar to his like teachers. Yeah, it's like a direct copy, practically. So even the hair, the way the hair is insane. I don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the actual artist, what they felt, what they're trying to communicate, but the fact is, like, Northcote probably saw Saunders perform, and then was inspired enough to actually create this painting, and that he was so popular at the time that the art gallery wanted that painting. It was an exhibition, the first exhibition by the art gallery. It said it got an award for the best painting, like the most interesting painting of the collection. So that's that. The one on Mulready's painting is very interesting. Mulready has some kind of stereotypical depictions of Black people in some of his paintings. That's kind of questionable. But this actually does look like Aldrich. It looks more like his features. And so I don't necessarily know. There's no knowledge, no information about whether or not how the stadium went or why it was painted. It just exists, and it was done the exact same time, pretty much, as the one on the right. So that's all I have about the artists. For my upcoming chapter with Aldrich, I do plan on pulling from Othello and thinking about how is Shakespeare actually talking about him, and thinking about what's being depicted in the arts at the time, like how they really think about Othello versus the source material, and how all the depiction of Aldrich, I think, combats a lot of those kind of stereotypes that a lot of times they were depicting with white actors. Another random thing that's really interesting is that Aldrich also did whiteface in plays. So he played King Lear in whiteface, which is so interesting because obviously, for Othello, they always did blackface or brownface. So he kind of flips the script, which I think is like so interesting.
Are there images of that?
So there's no. They're not images of him in whiteface, but there are. So if you talk about photography, later on in his career, he was photographic crazy. There's an image of him as King Lear in a wig and whole costume and looking very decrepit and old and kind of a lot of energy, a lot of intensity, but he's not in whiteface for that portrait. If it is, I can't tell. Because it's very, it's the kind of monochromatic kind of colors, and so it's not, you don't get the real tonal shifts. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. You mentioned this idea of portraiture as like sort of generative of like sort of social or generative or social mobility almost, or what did you say? I think assimilation. Yeah.
So there's various things, but you said go ahead and ask your question. Sorry, I will see.
Yeah. No. I don't know anything about this.
Oh, this is totally fine. Yeah.
But then when you were talking about the Dido portrait, you were talking a lot about like sort of what was socially acceptable.
Yeah.
And the limitation there. So how are you sort of navigating that line of sort of creation of identity and also sort of social limitation on what can be created? Yeah,
the title one's a little more complex. I'll go back to the portrait. So is part of your question asking why it's also would have been improper to have it in a certain way, or?
I'm just sort of curious what your
thoughts
like how you're
like the whole family.
The whole family, yeah.
The whole family couldn't have done the whole thing.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna break this down. So they could do the whole family because, again, I stated before, so her uncle, her great uncle was the Chief Lord Justice of England, of Britain. He's the most he's the most powerful judge, the whole nation, right? And comes from a long line of nobility. And the fact that he raised a mixed race woman was known, but not really talked about that well. I mean, it was known, but they're like, oh, he's this girl who he's very fond of, and talks about how he's related to her once in a blue moon, only certain people. But the thing is, because of how she is illegitimate, that's a major thing too to consider, and mixed race, because the whole idea is racial hierarchy. She's not at all the same level as her white cousin, who is born legitimate. Her father is going to be the heir to the family manor, and she marries quite well. She has a whole title and everything. And so because of that, there are different levels, right? And at the time in the Georgian era, where you were in society was very important. And it's as a person now, it's hard for me to kind of comprehend, right? Why does it matter what people think? But public persona, we call it, criticism was really important. And so the fact that people will be upset or say it's insulting to her and they're presented the same, showing their close familiar relationships, that would be really bad. And so they had to tiptoe in a way with this, because I don't really know, it's hard to explain as to why, but I just see the fact that the artist was limited of how he could depict the Black sitter. And the way that is also more favorite portrait, not just of with her cousin, who she's literally raised with, like as like not really a sister, but pretty close to family relationship. Like they were raised together, same education, everything. But when they went out in public, Dido had to stay at home or stay in the background. But this thing is interesting that it also was a portrait of most of the family, because this setting actually is at Kenwood House, which is in London, which is actually Lord Mansfield's like estate. That was really famous. He was famous for having this estate, building this whole house by Robert Adam, and it was like the crown jewel for him, right? And he gave tours. So this actually is it's actually in the backyard of that, and here is a view of London. Can't tell in this painting right now, but you see St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral. Also, there's a little bridge right here. It's actually a sham bridge. So in a way, I tried to walk over it. It's not real. But in a way, the inclusion of London, also inclusion of this, knowing it's a state, that's also representing her uncle, her great uncle who raised her. So it wouldn't be proper for her and him to have like side by side portrait, but it's kind of through proxy, right? And also, I didn't talk about this. It's more my chapter, not more details. The clothing, like seen here, the clothing that is from there is her aunt, and the pearl necklaces is very similar to that. Actually very similar to the gold trimming that she's wearing in this dress. Also, there's a portrait of her, I'm going to say adoptive mother, who's is Mansfield's wife, who raised her, who has a portrait of her sister in her as a young woman before they got married. The composition is very similar to this in the way the outdoor setting, the use of flora kind of connects them that way. So it's more like it's a family portrait. If you know the family, you're in the house, you're looking around and see, comparing the different portraits together, and also kind of understanding how objects or a place can represent someone. Yes. I hope I answered your question. I'm so sorry. But yeah.
Since we're on this painting again, what's your interpretation of the facial expressions? They seem different to me. To people.
Yeah. It is weird. Honestly, the fact they're smiling is actually kind of impressive, like for the period. But facial expressions, well, what a lot of people point out in their analysis of this painting is that Dido looks very kind of like coyish, kind of like playful, right? And someone had a researching this. Someone was like, "Oh, the word Dido ends up meaning playful later in time. That's why she looks so playful." And it's like, what's that personality? We don't know. But the fact that it just seems very intimate and kind of like companionship, like I enjoy your presence. It's what I kind of see it as, and I don't really answer this, but I feel like the expression seems like a sense of familiarity and comfortability that is not necessarily unique to the period, but it is a strong suit in this portrait. Because especially if you think about like 40, 50 years earlier, a lot of the portraits are very stiff and looks like little dolls kind of together and like, hello family, kind of think that. So this is very much saying, and my interpretation of this is that they were sitting together at this bench, and then all of a sudden Dido has to go, I gotta go. But her cousin's like, hey, wait, actually don't go yet. Like, hang out with me more. That's how I kind of read it as. But yeah. Go ahead.
So should we interpret the fact that one of them is holding the book and the other one is holding the book?
Yep. You look at that. So that's the kind of playing with the whole stereotype, so the idea of like, okay, so this one, she's learned class, she's upper class person, has a certain kind of education, even though Dido didn't know how to read. She knew how to read. She recited Greek and Latin in poetry. Lord Mansfield actually had her as a child recite some famous poem to a group of people at his house. And he's like, look how smart my daughter is. He didn't call her daughter, but whatever. So playing the idea of English kind of superiority in a way. Also, she's wearing roses, the English rose. So that is, she's the Englishness, like representing whiteness and purity of England in a way. Even though she was half German, but whatever. It was monarchy too, all that. And then Dido obviously has the exotic ripe fruits, the idea of like of the colony, especially the Caribbean, of having a lot of resources that England could take, and also her fertility. Think about that. And there's a lot of stereotype at the time, especially of mixed race women, of being hypersexualized. They're the good in the West Indies. a lot of white men liked mixed race women because they were civilized enough with the whiteness side, but still like debauched or sexually liberated enough to for the black side. That's a perception. So it does kind of play into that. And so again, and with Dido, she didn't, even though she had a privileged upbringing, she still had a hard time. It's not like she lived like free. She didn't marry anyone with title. She did inherit a lot of money, but she still was limited to what she could do with that. And even when she inherited money, it was still a lot less than her white cousin. Because again, not only his race, but also the fact that she's illegitimate. That's a big, big factor. Yeah,
I was wondering, just given on how like you talked about terms like colonial contact,
cultural cross-dressing, yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking of all these other terms, like there was hybridity you mentioned, cross-cultural, transcultural, like passing, posing, like how do you come to these terms given like each term, though they may like imply similar things, have very different nuances and very different critiques. How are you kind of approaching that kind of language, especially talking about something like this?
Yeah. With this, because it's difficult sometimes to figure out what term to use, and sometimes I admit like I can use the wrong term by accident, right? I'm like so trying to figure it out. But the main thing is I really consider the sitter in the context of the sitter. So thinking about like, are they actually born in this area, born in Britain? Do they have a background somewhere else where they actually sorry, quick example I think of. So this is what I think of for like this, for example, is like cross-dressing, right? And this is more the kind of like the hybridity in a way, because in a way he's the person on the right in the turban is dressed in West African Muslim attire, but the fact that he's still in the conventions of British portraiture. So in that way he's also using his clothing to communicate certain ideas as like leverage. But so really to answer your question really simply, context, based by case, and trying to see like, is it appropriate to use this term? And also, if anyone ever wants to enlighten me about certain terms and how to use them correctly, I am more than happy to do so. But again, because of how complex and different each sitter is, it's kind of like I have to go be careful about that. So thank you for bringing that to mind, actually.
What's that around his neck, by the way?
So it's actually a copy of the Quran. He hand wrote. He memorized the whole Quran. He was a very studious, devout Muslim, and he actually wrote it from memory like 2 or 3 times on his journey from the Americas back to England and then to Africa. So to show his religious devotion, he talked about how important his religion is to him. So it's supposed to say, hey, I'm Muslim, you didn't know. I saw a hand back there.
Yeah, thank you. So this was really fascinating, and I appreciate the presentation. And I just had 2 questions. One is, I know very little about portraiture, so like looking at the way that you're thinking about the codes, how things are encoded, and I really appreciated that breakdown. And I had a question around color.
Yes.
That's kind of similar. I was curious, because in thinking about the Aldridge paintings, and we have like the 4 up there, like to kind of show the progression. So, yeah, even like, so there's like this turquoise element, and I'm just curious, I'm just drawn to that color anyways, but I'm just curious, is that a sign of the time period? Is that a sign of the
this one right here?
Yeah, all 3 of them. Okay. There's a way that turquoise, and in fact, even further back, like almost through all of your slides, there's like the blues are in the turquoise vein, and so I'm just really curious. Like, I mean, maybe that's nothing, but I was just curious if there was anything related to color, and how palette was, if there was any codification of palette.
One thing I gotta say is these colors look different than my laptop, so it's actually more saturated here. Okay. So it's actually not as bright blue like that. But throughout history, art history, blue is a very expensive color, so in shades of blue. So oftentimes like try to show value in that way. Right. But in my understanding for 18th century, I don't necessarily have an answer for that. Certain colors obviously are used for contrast, right? And think about, especially if the background here is a very common trope to have, or motif to have, like a kind of stormy background with a little bit of having some insight to the blue sky, which kind of reflects maybe the mental, the mental state of the person, and how like they have so many conflicting thoughts, and they have so much to think about, right? And also another way to highlight the head too, bring attention to the head. But to answer your question, I don't necessarily have a set value or meaning for the colors like that, but certain colors are in their history associated with royalty and things like that. So and this one actually really looks less similar to a lot of reminds me of like Baroque era and kind of almost Renaissance era of painting, where it has the blue is for the back. If I have the term, I should know that term. And so in my mind, this is more kind of reference to that because it's supposed to occur in that time period in a way, right? So it's kind of setting the scene of like, he's in Venice and, or Italy, it's Venice, but this doesn't look like Venice at all to me. But kind of like with kind of that connection there of like the environment, but also the colors used for the environment.
Cool thing. And that's like, just even knowing the expense of it is really helpful.
Yeah.
And then the second question is kind of benign, but it's like the Saunders portraits, or a couple of these are like in the same year. And so is that because like that was just a moment, like their moment to shine and therefore like they were all about the portraits at that moment? Or is it just, I'm just curious if there's any like why these are so close together.
So for Saunders, it's because he got a lot of money really recently. So he went to London. It's like, oh, people are like, I'm a prince. Like, yeah, he never corrected anyone. Like he didn't say he was a prince, but he would just go.
Prince Rogers Nelson. I mean,
he's like, who's that?
Prince.
Prince. Sorry, I was like, okay. Sorry. Actually, Prince actually is a very common name actually in the Americas in the time period, which I had no idea until I looked into this chapter. It's actually
Campbell.
Exactly.
So, but again, in Britain, it's not the same case, right? So Prince, so he came in, he had money, he obviously had status, and then we became the, I'm going to say pretty much ambassador or envoy for Haiti. The king gave him more money, right, to represent the country. So he was like, oh, I need this, this, and this. So I would say that's kind of the reasoning behind the height. Is like he's literally at the highest point, socially speaking, that he had compared to before. So why not commemorate that, right? Also, he really wasn't into like his looks. The king got mad at him a lot for overspending. Just a fun fact. So, he's one to dress up and show off his wealth and his intelligence. And if he could show it off through painting and, make it a permanent kind of thing, he'll do that. And for Aldridge, it's really because he debuted that year, and he was a big deal. Like it was talked about everywhere. He actually went on tour. He actually traveled from like London to Manchester, other different cities, and even to Ireland, performing as Othello. And so that's why it was kind of pretty groundbreaking, because even though some people were some people were critical of his performance, it still made the news, right? And so, and a lot of times, especially towards the late 18th century, there was a kind of trend of depicting like Shakespearean like actors or Shakespearean scenes, and so it kind of goes in with that too, of like people were interested in seeing Shakespeare depicted in some form or another. So yeah, I hope that answers. Okay, I know we're out of time, by the way, but yes, I'm going to go with this person because they haven't talked yet.
Hi, thank you. I have sort of two-part quick question, specifically about Aldridge and Saunders, which is just as folks who are performers fundamentally, like an orators, is there any record that you know of either of them talking about art or portraiture or what is that kind of thing? Obviously, Saunders wrote a lot. It makes sense that he would have, with Evans as an emissary, been painted in that way for Haiti in that moment. But I'm wondering if there's any account, self-narration, and then also just how tied to that, how you're thinking of performance itself as it relates.
Yeah. So for Saunders, he did not write about painting at all. And he actually was really more of an orator, and the only book he has is like the Haitian papers, but he also had a little thing, he had a lot of letters, whatever. And he also went on tour speaking tours to advocate for abolition of enslaved individuals and also for Black people to immigrate to Haiti. But he definitely was a performer in a sense of like the whole persona he provided, and is very much thinking about how can I use this in a way, how can I, take advantage of the situation, take advantage of this moment, right? But I don't have anything about actual portrait itself, but also just really looking at his clothing and how, like, even in a lot of the diaries and of other people, like John Quincy Adams and letters, they talk about how well dressed he is and how he's so composed and so put together. So that kind of performance of like, I am this elite individual, kind of, he thought well of himself, which is, I think, rightfully so. But not having no shame about it too, because he's Black. He's like, I'm not ashamed to be Black. I'm very much like, he has really strong African features. So kind of playing into like, yeah, if you want to think of me, the only possibility of me being this way is because I'm a prince. Sure, let's go for that. I'm pretend to be a prince. So definitely performance is constantly happening, but not saying the artistic sense, but more the social everyday sense. And then the other question was, for Aldridge, he didn't talk about portrait that I know of yet, but I'm still working my third chapter. And he wrote a memoir. I'm going to see if he actually did talk about the portrait paintings. I haven't seen anything about that, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that he might have talked about that. But he definitely was. He was definitely depicted a lot in portraits and also etchings and a lot of photography. So that's that kind of thing. But he might have seen it more as like a, you call it, career-oriented kind of tool, but rather than like your personal thing. So, and then the question.
We'll make this the last one.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the sketch or the of Aldrich?
Aldrich, okay.
Is that what you call it, a sketch?
It's an engraving, technically speaking. It's actually a stipple, yeah.
I was gonna ask, like, how would
Or etching, sorry.
an etching? What are the? I don't know anything about art. So what are the techniques that the artists use, and like why? What would this etching look like if the person was racialized as white? Like, what are the different?
That's a good question.
Black and white, no color.
Yeah. So actually, this photo was I took it myself. I went to the British Museum and they had this. So I did look at other etchings because thinking about that. When as a white person, they were obviously the skin. They don't. It's a negative space in a way. There might be a little bit of shading, but it's the lines. It's a lot more fine line work, and so it's very like. They tend to be more of emphasis actually on the clothing too. So this is the opposite, where this his color of his skin is really emphasized. The first thing you see, and even the way he's positioned, it's like everything important is right there, right? And so that's where it differs mainly with that. Also, they tend to, as a white individual, often tend to have kind of more of a background, right? Like it's like, I'm a study, kind of contextualizing the space itself, whereas this is kind of a little more less detailed. The chair and the books are really kind of sketched in, So I hope it answers your question a bit.
What does that mean to you?
So what it means to me, especially with the emphasis on the skin tone, it means to me, honestly, is that there is definitely a focus on his blackness, and that is also, it could be whether or not the artist thought that, but also like the fact that this is actually used for a frontispiece for his book, like emphasizing this is a black person writing this book. Everything you see here comes from black people, because there were actually accusations of Europeans saying that, the Haitians and the black people were actually hiring Europeans to write this stuff. It's not any of the original content, right? And Saunders he explicitly says in the book, he's like, that's not the case. We're black. We all wrote this. It's never impressed. It may have someone mixed race, but they're from Haiti, kind of contextualizing that, So I think that is really to bring attention from the get-go of the book that this person is of color, and also showing his own kind of pride in his color. So, yeah, I hope that answers a bit.
Fantastic talk.